Hi, my name is Matthew Fuller from the Digital Culture Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London, and this is
Ramon from the Center of Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths.
And we're here today to interview Rob Kitchin about his recent book, The Data Revolution. So first of all, Rob, an initial question: what made you write the book? It's a fantastic kind of survey of the field. It really kind of brings out all the possibilities and contradictions within the question of big data. But what was the underlying motive?
So on the one hand, I've kind of been working around kind of digital infrastructures, ICT, its effects on society for quite a long period of time. And quite a while ago, I did some work around more on the infrastructure side, so kind of atlas of cyberspace, mapping cyberspace, and then kind of moved more into the software side and kind of software studies and having to think about the kind of role of code and algorithms and so on, shaping everyday life. And then obviously a big component of that is data. So it's kind of a third part, really, in some ways, of a trilogy of kind of infrastructure, software, and data. And also just trying to cut through some of the kind of the hype and the hubris that's been around some of the big data discourse and around some of the open data discourse. And actually kind of saying, look, there's a lot of things that we actually need to kind of think through here, and it's not just a kind of a cheerleading and a celebration of what the data might mean for business or government or research, but it's actually starting to get into the nitty-gritty of what are the kinds of the implications around what does the data might mean for, how society is governed, how business is conducted, how we do research, how we kind of think about the world and so on, how we kind of know it and understand it, and then how we deploy that knowledge to make certain things happen. So it was really, I guess, about trying to take some ideas of social theory, really, and apply them through and to get beyond this kind of hyper and hubris. So it's not that I'm kind of anti any of these kind of things. I'm more just, can we start to unpack them a bit more and get a bit of a better understanding of what's happening? And that really wasn't there. At the time I was started to write in 2012, there were little bits and pieces. The kind of the Dana Boyd, Kate Crawford paper had kind of come out, and that kind of started being a bit more academic interest. But there really was very little else there.
I mean, your book is quite timely because especially emphasizing big and big data. I mean, so much of our lives is being captured through data. I mean, is this only the tip of the iceberg? I mean, will the big get bigger?
Yeah, there's no doubt, because just more and more aspects of our everyday lives are being captured by various kinds of technologies and various kinds of socio-technical systems, whether that's government systems or business systems, transportation systems, and so on. So I kind of put the big data into kind of three main groups. I kind of directed, which is people kind of still in charge of the system. So it might be like your camera system, CCTV. You saw somebody in the control room, pointing the camera, zooming in, zooming out, tracking across, and so on. Or it might be the kind of the digitization of millions of books and documents and films and audio recordings and so on. There's a kind of an automated set, so kind of automated forms of surveillance. So your camera system's kind of working off of a set of algorithms that are kind of facial recognition, pattern recognition algorithms shaping what's being looked at and how the data's being processed and so on. All kinds of digital devices, so your smartphones and your cameras are all recording various bits of data. You can have sense data, so there's sensors being put all around us in the environment, whether it's parking sensors or pollution sensors, or on the barriers through tolls, and or in the checkout where you scan the items across the till, and it's recording your purchases and your credit card transactions, and so on. The Internet of Things and machine-to-machine communication. So there's all kinds of ways in which we capture that. And then the third part is the data that we volunteer. So we volunteer it through social media. We give our thoughts and our opinions and our photographs and sound files and so on. We can crowdsource it. So it might be contribute to Wikipedia or contribute to OpenStreetMap. It might be citizen science projects. It might be it's the last one I'm trying to think of. you get the idea. Oh, wearables, so Fitbit and fuel bands or whatever that are kind of pulling back your sleep patterns and your body temperature and your heart rate and your pulse and your how many steps you've taken and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's more and more bits of data are being caught about us, and obviously we give lots of data into government systems when we apply for various types of things, whether it's applying for welfare or applying for passports or whatever it is. So there's lots and lots of data now, and what's different is not just simply the volume, it's the speed. So some people would say, "Oh, the census is big data," and it is large data. But it's very large, small data in the sense of it's kind of once every 5 years or 10 years. It only has kind of 30-odd questions on it, and they're structured questions. And once you start, you can't change. You have to stick. You have to stick with what you've got and so on. Whereas big data is also exhaustive. So the census is exhaustive, but the big data tries to be exhaustive within its domain, capture everything within its domain rather than being sampled. But it's much faster flowing. So like Facebook is trying to deal with 300 million photo uploads a day and 1 billion comments and 1 billion likes and whatever else. And Walmart's trying to deal with 1 million customer transactions every hour. It's a different scale and it's a different volume and speed, and it's a different granularity often of the data. So there's a kind of qualitative shift, I think, was what's happening with big data. On the small data, the shift is to openness and also to linking. So you can take all the data that are within lots of research projects, and you can start to put them into single repositories and then start to use the metadata to link the data across the various projects. So like one project I've been involved in is the Digital Repository of Ireland. And in that we're working with things like the National Archives, National Museum, National Gallery, the National Broadcaster, various other kinds of cultural institutions as well as the universities to pull in all the data. And the idea is say I was interested in Carrick Shannon in County Roscommon, I could put that and it would pull out anything about Carrick Shannon from all of those various different databases. Whereas before it would have been really difficult for me to do that. It would have been a lot of archival work, it would have been a lot of messing around in boxes, and it would have taken forever, right, to go across all of those institutions and find everything. So that's the kind of the power of what's happening with small data. So small data is being made a bit more big in the sense that you can take the analytics that you use in big data and then start to apply that to smaller data that's been scaled.
One of the problems that big data researchers find is a lot of the information that's available comes pre-categorized. So it's already categorized by geographic location, time, keywords, and so on. So it's difficult to find things that the machine hasn't already pre-coded. I was wondering what strategies there are for big data researchers to kind of go beyond that.
Well, so the data analytics is not really my area. In that I'm a kind of a social scientist rather than a computer scientist. But I think what they would say is that they would kind of use the machine learning and that you just kind of unsupervised and unsupervised, and you'd want to supervise and try and work out and train the programs to sort the data in the way that you wanted it sorted or classified as opposed to the way that it might have been collected. So you might want to look at ways of disaggregating and reaggregating and so on. Or depends on what scale of the data you have to begin with, whether you can do that. I mean, one of the real issues around big data is most of it is held within private institutions. They're either generated by companies or it's generated by state agencies. And in both cases, it's actually quite difficult to get access to it. I mean, some things like Twitter you can apply, or you can get like a spritzer feed, like a 1% sample, and so on. But otherwise, the data is kind of locked inside of Twitter, or it's locked inside of Facebook, or it's locked inside of Walmart or Tesco's, or it's locked inside of the police service or the state service and so on. So there's a question there of there's a lot of data there that might give us lots of value, but who kind of gets to control it and who gets to analyse it and who gets to say what happens with it. And clearly, because the data does have a lot of value, and so it can tell us lots of useful things for kind of sorting and classifying people and then giving people different conditions based on that, different services based on that. There's a big data brokerage industry, and that's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And we really have very, very little idea about what goes on inside of there and what kinds of data they're doing, what kinds of projects they're doing, programs they're doing, and so on. So we know in terms of the products that we can buy from them or rent from them. Mostly you rent the data as opposed to buy the data. But we don't really know the extent to what they hold, which is why a number of them were kind of brought in by the FTC in the US to actually start to kind of find a process of kind of opening them up and making them a little bit more transparent as to what it is that they're doing and so on. And clearly they really affect people's life chances in terms of, you know, whether you do get credit or not, whether you get the mortgage or not, whether you know you get the job or not. You know, people are sifting through this data and making decisions based on what they think the data shows. But it's very difficult for us to know what data is held about us and also to correct it because it's locked inside of these silos.
You know, speaking of transparency, as more information is being collected, the more data has become synonymous with privacy. But you know, data isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it helps us make better medical decisions. It helps release traffic congestion. It helps us fly better, shop better. But is there a negative side to data collection?
So in the book previous to this, in the coding space, myself and Martin Dodge kind of made an argument around, you know, that there is always positives and negatives to this. You know, I think there's the quote that technology is never good or bad, but it's nor is it ever neutral. Is kind of idea. So, and a lot of the ways that these things work is we wouldn't go along with them if we didn't get benefits. So they kind of interpolate us, they seduce us, they give us these. So I'm prepared to give you my shopping data if you're prepared to give me vouchers for things off. There's a kind of a trade. I'm prepared to throw out my comments on Twitter and know that Twitter will monetize them because I'm getting the communication, the interaction, I'm getting a benefit from it. If I didn't perceive there was a benefit, I'd probably walk away from it unless I felt I was locked in and there was no alternative. At the same time, the data is being used in all these ways around social sorting, redlining, around, you know, your credit histories, your credit ratings, your access to finance, your access to education or to work and so on. It is now starting to feed into things like dynamic pricing. So they look at you as a potential, the value of you as a customer, and then make decisions about what you will be offered as opposed to what you will be offered as opposed to what I'll be offered. You know, you can go to some supermarkets now where everybody in the shop is paying a different price for the carton of orange juice, depending on their previous shopping history and their user profile and how the shop wants to push certain items to you as opposed to other people and so on. And actually getting kind of in-store vouchers as you move around the shop and so on. So, and obviously it can be used in quite pernicious ways around things like anticipatory governance, where you make decisions about what somebody might do in the future based on a profile now. So the kind of the classic example at the minute is the Chicago police force using predictive profiling to make decisions about who might be future criminals, and then kind of knocking on the door and saying, you know, our algorithms are telling us that you're a pre-criminal, that you're likely to be involved in crime, and we're telling you that we're already watching you, you know, as a way of kind of trying to deter future crime. But of course, that's making a judgment about what somebody may or may not do without any evidence that they've ever committed a crime, right? So due process would normally be that you can't go and question somebody unless you've got reasonable suspicion. A reasonable suspicion is not that your friends have been arrested, it's that you've done something. Now, if that data got flagged up in a database and that database then got sold on, I might not get a job as labelled as pre-criminal because I've been labelled pre-criminal even though I've never done anything wrong. You know, so the data can have this kind of going out into the future, affecting my future life chances and so on. So it's those kinds of issues I think we need to think through, like what are the implications of predictive profiling and anticipatory governance and the ways in which it can negatively affect things. People ending up on no-fly lists and then finding it almost impossible to get themselves off of those lists because they don't know why they're on in the first place. So there are various kinds of issues that we need to be mindful of, as well as the positives, and it's about trying to get that balance right. And do we really need to do things like track people's movements right across the city by pulling off their MAC addresses of their smartphones and so on? Is that a good thing? I don't know if you saw the thing last night, but it was a kind of an article yesterday or the day before about Uber and the app on the phone, and it's pulling everything off the phone: your call history, your email history, all your app use, all the Wi-Fi signals that are near to you, everything. Like the data that's coming off is way beyond just your use of a taxi app. It's everything that you do with your phone is streaming off and going back to them. And it's also going back to lots of other apps that are on your phone where you have this massive breakdown on privacy statement. And in fact, in a lot of apps, you don't have any privacy statement. You by using the app, that's you're kind of giving consent just simply by using the app to then pulling all other kinds of data off. And then what happens with that data?
Given what you're saying about Uber and other systems such as this, what's the value of looking at data specifically rather than the wider assemblages that they're part of?
I do make that case in the book, and I forward this notion of the data assemblage, and kind of say that it's not just about looking at the data; it's about looking at this whole array of what happens. So the kinds of the forms of knowledge that are used to inform how you put your system together, your systems of thought, the political economy, the finance, so the venture capital, the way the banks lend to startups and so on, that can then condition how they might then push their product through. There's obviously legal issues, governmentality kinds of issues, there's materialities, there's how institutions and different kind of bodies work with each other. There's kind of individual subjectivities about how they see the world, and then how they put that into code, and how they would use that to either generate the data or process the data or manage it, and so on. So there's a whole kind of suite, and obviously there's the marketplace and what people are prepared to purchase, what people are prepared to give up in terms of their data and so on. So there's a whole swirl of different kinds of structures and processes that are shaping how data is generated, how it's managed, how it's processed, how it's structured, how it's shared, how value is leveraged off of it, how insight is produced out of it, and so on. And I guess part of the argument I'm making in the book is about trying to unpack that data assemblage, and also look at the kind of the genealogy of how they kind of unfold over time and maybe shift. So things like control creep happening, which is one system that was designed to collect data on one set of things, then creeps into doing other things. So it might be traffic cameras that were only ever introduced to do traffic, which are now also doing other kind of criminal activities, and might be trying to do monitor terrorist potentialities and so on. So systems kind of creep across and start to do other kinds of things. So just trying to get a handle on how do all these things kind of interrelate, because it's not just simply the data. And then the other kind of thing I've been just starting to do more recently, it's not really in the book, is think more about the kind of the technology stack. So you've got kind of data in the middle, but if you kind of think you've got the infrastructure at the bottom, and then you've got your operating system, and then you've got your software, and then you've got your data, then you've got your kind of interface, and then you've got your user. And it's how the whole stack kind of works, and it's actually difficult. So in a way, one of the problems of the book says it goes infrastructure, software, data, and really it needs to be stacked and look at all the various bits, because the decision about what operating system you use is predicated on what infrastructure you've got. The software you use is kind of predicated a little bit on your kind of operating system. How your data and your software kind of are quite interlinked in that obviously software is predicated on pushing through input and output based on the data. Obviously, the user interfaces, how people interact with it, and it's a whole thing together. So it's the whole police camera network together, or it's the whole research infrastructure together. I'm just trying to start to get a handle on how that works together.
Yeah.
In previous conversations, just private conversations, speaking on data collection and data aggregation and so on and so forth, I often hear people say it's unfair that so much data is being collected. However, in order for me to use this service, such as the app, or I know there are certain places in London now where they capture data before you can actually enter. It's not fair, but the only way I can enter or use the app is to relinquish this information. How do you think that relates to? Is there any relief to that? Does that relate to this thing called open data practices, or are we just passive consumers at this point?
I'm not sure everybody is a passive consumer. I think everybody is kind of making this trade, and you're right, in some cases you're not making the trade because there's actually no alternative. You either do this or you don't fly, basically. If you don't offer the passenger the PRN, right, you don't get on the plane. And if that doesn't then correlate with other databases that they then put the information against, you don't fly. So I mean, there is a trade there, but it's a very loaded trade in that sense. But the openness thing isn't necessarily really about privacy. I think the openness debate is really around governance, and it's around kind of transparency, openness, transparency, participation are kind of the key words, and it's about taking the information that resides within government departments, semi-state agencies, local authorities, and so on, and opening that out and making it available to people. On the one hand, so they can kind of see and hold accountable how their tax money is being spent, and officials and how they make decisions and so on. And on the other hand, it's about monetizing that data. So corporations are not interested in this for the greater good of society. They want the data so they can monetize it. They can add value to it and either sell it back to local authorities or sell it on as commercial, sell it on as commercial products, because the data, again, it tells you useful things and you can do useful stuff with it. Whereas the privacy debate, I think, is not really connected into that openness debate in that sense, other than to talk about kind of anonymization and de-identification and so on within those data sets that they're protected, you know. The other kind of thing to think about privacy is it's multifaceted. So there's lots of different dimensions of privacy, and then in terms of what can happen with the data. So it's not just that people kind of know about you, it's then what they can do with that data in terms of exposing you or stealing your identity or doing other things with that. So there's a few kind of things happening kind of around that.
Okay, so I mean, talking about privacy and the relationship between privacy and open data, in a sense, there's a linked dynamic that operates between them. So on the one hand, you have local government, for instance, in the UK, opening up data or certain kinds of data so that it can be entered into the services that the government is delivering can then be fought over in a quasi-market between a number of private companies. It's in a way, it's nothing really to do with transparency. It's integrated into the field of privatization. So it's in a sense is a means for disemboweling the democratic control of services and replacing them with a quasi-market of relatively oligopolistic companies that are built precisely to replace local government services. In terms of privacy, the question of privacy is maybe not the right way of staging it, but it's also about ways of engineering digital subjects that are there, that are produced in composition with algorithmic processes, data structures, and large-scale collection of data, and that are there. Some people characterize it as kind of digital shadows of people or digital doubles. In a way, what we're looking at is the same kind of operation, in the sense that local governance is replaced by a quasi-market, which figures people's accountability or the accountability for the delivery of services in one way, and the subject of the kind of in the classic kind of individual liberal sense, which is the mode in which privacy arguments are made, is replaced by a form of data aggregate, which can be operated upon, interrogated, and reformatted in certain ways. I just wonder whether there's a kind of continuity of operation that you can kind of give us some light on.
I mean, what you're kind of suggesting is there's a kind of a neoliberal processes happening on one hand on the government, on the other hand on the subject or on the citizen and so on. And I think that's probably the case to some degree. I don't think that the open data thing is purely about just marketization of the services and opening up, kind of hollowing out the state and opening up data services to the private sector who can then fill in.
No, it's certainly not. It's part of the.
It's part of the thing, but I mean, if you were to talk to people who work in kind of open governments, kind of advocacy and so on, that's not their agenda. Their agenda is very much around this kind of openness, accountability, transparency, efficiency. These kinds of arguments around trying to make government more effective, basically, and more accountable. So it wouldn't necessarily be about the marketisation of the service. And the same thing, I think, really with the privacy. I think that again, there's a kind of a suite of different positions in there, and some people would kind of say, it is about creation of a digital subject that's more easy, kind of to be able to monitor, and to regulate and control, and to exploit, extract value from, in one sense. And other people kind of say, well, this is actually about fundamental freedoms and about rights and about those kinds of issues. So I think in both cases they're quite broad debates. There's actually different constituencies, and I sat on the kind of the National Open Data Consultative Panel in Ireland, and it was a very interesting venue to be in because you had different constituencies. You had kind of civil society in there, you had universities in there, you had government in there, and you had industry in there, and they were all advocating for the same thing around opening up the data, but the agendas were entirely different. But they spoke with one voice. They said they could manage to find a single coherent voice where they could all agree. But the underlying thing as to why what they were hoping to get out of this, the discourse that they produced and the document they submitted to government was different things. So you have these kind of weird alliances going on that probably wouldn't have existed except there was a kind of a common outcome. But even with the common outcome, how they would then actually go and use the data and do things would have been entirely different as well. So it's one of these kind of strange, where you have these kind of odd alliances, like things like the Countryside Alliance, where you have this odd bunch of constituencies who can all kind of agree on one thing but differ on lots of other things, and are actually doing it for different purposes. So I think it's the same kind of thing. So, I do think there is a kind of a political economy going on, and there's a kind of an economic argument going on, but there is also this kind of more kind of political arguments going on, and ethical arguments going on around rights of the individual and so on. And some very interesting debates going on in the privacy debate about things like right to be forgotten and things like privacy by design and so on. So you build all the privacy in, and then you kind of volunteer the stuff out, as opposed to you're automatically volunteering unless you close down. So it's built the other way, and there seems to be quite a big push around, particularly from offices like data protection commissioners, information commissioners, towards this kind of privacy by design, for example. Obviously, industry has a different view on it because they want to be able to extract the value and monetize the data. So they want to be as kind of open as they can in some ways, and to have kind of market regulation as opposed to strong government regulation. So there's a kind of tension happening. I think some interesting debates happening. This kind of data protection, data minimization, de-identification debates.
Great. Well, I think we should stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jay.
Fantastic.